Morning, everyone. I hope you had a good break from the end of the fifth session, and we're starting a new one today. Imam Jallo, we have the floor for some.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين إن الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ربنا إننا آمنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وقنا عذاب النار الصابرين والصادقين والقانتين والمنفقين والمستغفرين بالإسحار شهد الله أنه لا إله وملائكته وأولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين.
Thank you very much, Imam Jallo. Bishop Odiko, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Lord God of mercy and of grace, of truth and of love, of reconciliation and of forgiveness and of judgment. As we sit in the TRRC, we pray, Lord, that as we seek to bring out the truth, that you will remove from our midst the Sambalats, and that you will instill in our midst the Nehemiahs, those who stand for the truth, and those who will, come what may, stand firm that truth will prevail at all times and in all situations and in all circumstances of human life. And so we ask that you will be with us as we conduct this affair to remedy the situation of ills in this country. And that even in the present situation, that we should not encourage such ills to happen within our midst. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Bishop Odiko, for that. Before we start the proceedings, I'll go through the traditional things, becoming traditional now, at the beginning of each session, to read a statement on behalf of the Commission, essentially recalling the highlights of the previous previous session, and tell you what to expect in the current session. So I'll read the statement on behalf of the Commission. The TRRC concluded its fifth session of hearings on Thursday, 27 June 2019. During that session, 15 witnesses testified before the Commission, including 3 women. That brings the total number of witnesses who have testified before the Commission to 72. The hearings of the fifth session focused mainly on the 1996 Denton Bridge incident involving security forces and the UDP supporters, the arrest and the detention of members of the UDP, both male and female, and the circumstances surrounding the murder of the late Minister of Finance, Usman Koro Sise. Witness testimonies revealed the commission by the security forces of gross violations and abuses of human rights of the victims. The violations and abuses perpetrated at Denton Bridge by the security forces included torture and degrading treatment. Witness testimonies during last session also shed light on the circumstances, as I mentioned earlier, surrounding the murder of Mr. Usman Koro Sise. In a subsequent hearing of the Commission, unfortunately, a key witness who was expected, among other things, to provide more information on the Koro Sise incident refused to testify before the Commission. leading to his arrest and the subsequent arraignment before the High Court to answer, among other charges, contempt of the TRRC. We fervently hope and pray that what happened here on Wednesday, June 26, involving Mr. Yankuba Toure, will never happen again. We also hope that what happened at the Kairaba police station will also not happen again. In this connection, we would implore all Gambians to always abide by the rule of law and to give peace and reconciliation a chance in our society. However angry or offended we feel, we should always endeavor to remain calm and adhere to the rule of law. We all must respect human rights and the rule of law, however challenging or inconvenient the situation. Our sixth session, which starts today, Monday, 8th July, will end on Thursday, July 25th, 2019. As we embark upon this sixth session, we expect them to hear testimonies on the suppression of the freedom of the press and the related human rights violations involving the media and the individual journalists. We also hope to hear testimonies from persons adversely mentioned in previous hearings. We remain grateful to all witnesses who have so far testified before the Commission. We are especially grateful to those courageous and dignified women who, despite the odds, were able to share their painful experiences with the Commission and the general public. In testifying before the Commission, these brave women not only educated us on their own personal plights, but also on the plights of their innocent families devastated by the acts of lawlessness, wrongful detention, and the state bullying of citizens, which should never happen in any civilized society. We wish to reassure them, or so reassure all victims and their families, that the TRRC values some of their contribution to our work, and that we will do everything in our power to ensure that they all get the justice, healing, and the reparations they deserve under the Act. We hope that many more witnesses will come forward and assist the Commission in carrying out its mandate to create an impartial record of human rights violations and abuses during the period July 1994 to January 2017. We are pleased to note that Gambians and the Friends of the Gambia across the board have taken ownership of the TRRC process, and that many are stepping forward to offer much needed support and solace to the victims of human rights violations and their families. The TRRC remains committed to fulfilling its mandate to assist the country on this difficult path to justice, healing, and reconciliation. The TRRC cannot do this without the support and the encouragement of the general public. And so, as always, we continue to crave the public's continued support, understanding, and the prayers. That's the end of the statement on behalf of the Commission. Council, are we ready with this morning's witness? If we are, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, and members of the audience. Yes, indeed, we are ready to proceed with today's proceedings. But before then, I just wish to indicate that, as you have rightly alluded to, we have not yet quite finished the investigations in the Usman Korosise murder incident. There are still a few good witnesses or important witnesses who are yet to testify, Mr. Ture including. We are doing our utmost to ensure that every witness involved or any person we know to have information about that particular incident would come before the commission and testify. This is a people's commission. The people have taken ownership of it. It's our responsibility to ensure that the hopes and expectations of the people are not dashed. In that regard, we would do our utmost to ensure that all those relevant witnesses would appear before the commission and explain their sides of the story. And I underline credible witnesses, not anybody who thinks he or she has something to say. This should be limited to credible witnesses because Gambians are entitled to the truth and not a person's own concocted version of what that person thinks ought to be the truth. With regards to this session, it would be dedicated mainly to the attempts by the previous government to muscle the media. The media, as important it is in a democratic society, we have seen in Gambia, it has been reduced to basically a compliant institution when this is supposed to be a watchdog to the society, not just the government. So we would dedicate a bit of time to this inquiry. We would ask you to crave your indulgence. Our chronology today would be a little off. Ordinarily, we should start with a context witness who would just deliver the bones, and then we would have the victims to really fill in the bones and provide more detailed testimony. Unfortunately, that is not possible today in view of the fact that we had some logistical issues to deal with. But this morning, we would start with Horeja Balagay, and she would ably lead our witness to talk about his own victimization and things that he witnessed regarding the media. And thereafter, we would have a representative of the Gambia Press Union to talk about the general victimization of the media. So over to you, Horeja. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fall. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning to you all. We are ready to proceed with the witness. I kindly ask the usher to bring the witness in. Thank you.
I, Lamin Cham, do swear that I will speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Please take a seat, Mr. Cham. Good morning to you, and welcome to the TRRC.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you for making the time to appear before the Commission and testify. We already met, so you know my name. I will be representing the commissioners today and asking you questions in order to provide the public with additional information about what happened.
Okay.
Please be mindful that in the hearing room, there is interpretation into the local languages.
Okay.
Therefore, kindly allow a few seconds in between our speeches in order to allow the interpreters to finish what they're interpreting. And also, please speak slowly. Additionally, if my questions are unclear or you would like me to repeat, please feel free to do so.
Right.
For your information, today's session, I intend to cover 3 main topics. The first being your background and professional experience. Mm-hmm. Thereafter, we will talk about the role of journalists generally, as well as the climate under the previous regime, the climate under which journalists operated. And we will conclude with your own victimization and the impact that that has had on you, your colleagues, as well as your family. Is that clear?
Yeah, okay.
So I'll just proceed now with my questions. Please state your full name for the record.
My name is Lamin Cham.
Mr. Cham, can you tell us when and where you were born?
I was born on April the 27th, 1965,
And where were you born?
in Collier Village, Eastern Kiang, the Lower River, Division then, now region.
Okay. Can you briefly tell us about your educational background? So where you went to school and the dates, if possible, just the years.
I attended Kayaf Primary School from September 1972 to July 1978, and then Latrikunda Secondary School from 78 to 82, and then I enrolled at the WEC Mission. Then it was a mission run by Germans. They had a college for adult literacy teaching, and from then on I switched to my private GCO levels, and when I became a journalist, I underwent professional training at the BBC, trainable at Bush House, broadcast journalist and African Reporters One. And then I went back there to do a postgraduate diploma on general journalism, part-time at the London School of Journalism. I completed that.
So can you just tell us when you completed your course at the London School of Journalism?
I was between 2007 and 8. 2008 rather, 2007 to 2008.
Can you tell us when you started your career as a journalist?
I joined the Daily Observer. That's where I started in September 1992. And since then I have become a journalist. I've remained a journalist.
Well, if you can briefly run us through your career. You started in '92 at Daily Observer. What was your post at the time?
I was a freelance sports and general reporter. Later I was confirmed and appointed as a sports and general news reporter. I rose through the ranks to become editor-in-chief briefly in 2003, and then later full-time editor-in-chief in April 2005.
So you were editor-in-chief between 2003 and 2005 at the Daily Observer?
In between, 2003 briefly, but then I came back 2005.
And how long did you remain in that position in 2005?
I remained until I left later that year on October 5th, 2005.
You told us that you rose through the ranks. What are some of the other positions that you held before you became editor-in-chief at the Daily Observer?
Well, I was sports editor. That was exclusively mine. But I was also doing news reporting. At the Observer at the time, we do everything. Yes, I was specialized, but most of the people there do every other thing. So I was doing news and other things. But mainly, I was editor for sports. That was my domain for much of the time when I was there. But like I said, I was doing so many other things.
So when you left the Daily Observer in 2005, the latter part of 2005 in October, what did you do next?
Even before I left Observer, I had also freelance journalist in many places. I was freelance sports presenter and reporter on the television, GRTS, and I was freelance reporter for BBC World Service for sports. And later, when Ibrahim left, I was also doing freelancing for the BBC World Service news.
And which Ibrahima are you referring to?
I'm talking about Ibrahim Stilla. He's currently the Minister for Information and Communication Infrastructure.
So as someone who was a freelance sports reporter as well as a reporter who appeared on TV for the GRTS, would you say that you were very well known in the country around that time?
Yes, the job goes with that. Yes, I can say I was very well known around the country.
So easily recognizable?
Very much recognized. Wherever I went in this country, even now, a lot of people find it very easy to recognize me. Everybody knows me from television and newspaper.
So between 1992 up to now, 2009, in fact, before that, what is your current position?
Currently, I'm the editor-in-chief at the Standard newspaper.
So that's a long career in journalism from 1992 until 2019.
Yes.
About 27 years.
Yes. When I went there, I was a small boy. So Yes. Okay.
Can you tell us what the role of journalists are?
Well, of course, journalists, of course, are supposed to be watchdogs, the ears and eyes of the public, in terms of how their, government or their country is governed, who is governing them, what are they doing, and what they are not doing, and what are they supposed to do, and what mandates do they have to do that, etc., etc., and of course to be agents of communication between the governed and the people, as well as the other way around, from the people to the government. So basically the role of journalism is to be the ears and eyes of the public, and not compete to people who will communicate their concerns on their behalf to the powers that be, and the other way around. So journalists obviously are communication agents.
As a citizen, why should I care about journalists being able to exercise freedom of expression, freedom of the press? Why should I care about that? Can you explain that?
Well, that's quite important because without journalism, obviously, most of the things, activities in the world would definitely not be possible. I mean, we wouldn't know, for example, who is saying what or doing what on our behalf, and we would not even be able to take part in the national debate or in the affairs of our nation without being properly informed. And that is why you have to care whether journalists are free or not, because if they are not free, you will not get the independent and most informed education you need yourself to know how your society has been run. So it's very important for journalists to be free.
And in essence, you're saying without the information coming from journalists, we cannot hold our leaders accountable.
That will be very difficult.
So I'd like to focus on the period after the July 22nd coup d'etat. Were you still working at the Daily Observer at that time?
Yes, I started in 92. That was 2 years before the 1994 coup d'etat, and I continued. Well, before the 1994 coup d'etat, the press was relatively, I can say, free. Even though there were issues, but then there was no deliberate and very clear assaults on the media as it happened after 1994. Now, where I worked, the Daily Observer was definitely a typical example of the harassment that journalists and journalism suffered at the hands of the FPRC junta, and then, of course, which went on to bring about the PRC. So yes, the Observer was #1 place where I think the first, if I'm right, most serious adversaries against journalists occur.
So around that time in 1994, there was no social media.
No, there wasn't any social media.
And you've told us about the Daily Observer's importance at the time. Can you tell us the relationship between the Daily Observer and the AFPRC regime in the beginning?
Well, I can tell you that was before the advent of the television, so the AFPRC junta actually, in fact, relied on the Daily Observer for many reasons. One, it was the most popular, most widely circulated, most widely read, and the international community depended on news that is coming from the Daily Observer mostly. Of course, there are other papers like the Point, which preceded the Observer by 6 months or so. And then there was Foria, of course, which had been here 5 years before the Observer, or maybe even 7. But then the Daily Observer, like I said, because of its, because of the innovation, because of its nature, became instantly popular. And the everybody depended on the Observer. I remember myself being at a press conference where Cham himself first asked, "Is the Observer here?" And when they said it was here, then he continued. So that shows you how important the Observer was at the time.
So you would say that the AFPRC regime relied on the Observer in the beginning?
At the time, because that was before the advent of the television, they always make sure that every independent newspaper is present, especially the Observer.
Did the relationship between the AFPRC and the Daily Observer change after they came into power, meaning somewhere down the line?
Well, yes, because when the honeymoon was over, that is when everybody had their stories, and everybody went back to do their job. They went to administer, according to how they said, what they came for, and the media returned to work and put them to account. That's where the problem started.
And when would you say that this honeymoon between the media and the AFPRC actually?
Well, it didn't take long. We started hearing pronouncements like journalists are illegitimate sons of Africa. That came from Cham himself. I think that was a very first signal. He said that at the rally in Bakau where I myself covered.
Do you recall when that was?
It must be in the very beginnings of the junta's regime, maybe 94, 95.
Illegitimate sons of Africa.
Yeah, but then of course, even before that, I remember the very first time I saw or I experienced adversaries or the true nature of how they felt about the journal was one morning, just after the coup, this must be July the 25th or something, Sana Sabali came with a long convoy of vehicles, and they came into our office, the top floor. And, you know, in no time, the top floor was occupied by people in uniform, and they went into Mr. Best's office. I asked
Who was Mr. Best at the time?
Kenneth Best is the proprietor or the man who founded the Daily Observer. He is a Liberian. He's still alive. He came from Liberia and was in exile here, and then he set up the Daily Observer. They came in there, and they went into Mr. Best's office. I found out later what was all this about. The then editor, A.A. Barry, told me that the soldiers picked somebody who was selling the Observer at a price that was more than our official price, and they wanted to know why that was happening. So you could see a little thing like that, that brought the the vice chairman of the junta to our office in a very intimidating fashion. So since then, I know that we're going to be in trouble with these people.
So in fact, the honeymoon that you speak of didn't last more than a few days, it seems.
It didn't last.
So can you tell us how that relationship evolved?
It continued like that, and in matters came to a head when they started criticizing publicly what the Observer was publishing. I remember the earliest I remember was again the Daily Observer, because then I told you the Daily Observer was one of the most independent source of information in the Gambia. And we started running editorials, you know, and carrying news that's not necessarily their side of the story, but people, you know, scrutinizing their ways, their speeches, and their activities. I remember when the junta published a list, supposedly they said those were evidences of financial, you know, misappropriations, which of course was in fact a list of loans contracted, you know, by parliamentarians. They published those lists as cases of, you know, financial embezzlements. And one of the MPs, who was then of the opposition NCP, Majanko Samsa, was featured on the front page of the Observer, said Jammeh's actions were misleading because these were not monies that were accrued through fraudulent means. These were loans that were properly contracted, and they're going to pay the loans if they've not been thrown out of office. So that headline came, Jammeh's actions were misleading. I remember very well that was my first example of how they felt about what's been written about them. And I knew from there that they were not going to accept criticisms.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Cham, but I believe you're speaking too fast for the interpreters to catch up. Therefore, kindly slow down. This particular incident, do you recall when it occurred?
It was immediately after the coup, when they started, well, they believed they were starting to convince the people that the PPP regime was corrupt. One of the things they did was to publish this loan that they said was given to parliamentarians, and Majanko Samusa of the then opposition NCP said that act was misleading because these were not monies that were fraudulently acquired or given to them by any other means, but through loans that were properly processed.
And at that point, the Daily Observer had allowed the member of the opposition to appear on its front page.
Absolutely. He came to say that action was misleading.
And you said that's where you started receiving criticism.
That was my first experience, that these people are not going to accept criticisms.
Can you tell us what happened? What led you to believe that they will not accept criticism?
Well, I thought that was fair comment, simply. I mean, they were painting a picture, and this guy came up to say that, well, this is definitely not the way you are saying. This was loans that were properly contracted, and you cannot categorize them as misappropriation of funds, even though the NCP was in their position. But they were fair enough to say that this case is not misappropriation because they were loans, and they wouldn't take that. So I think the problem was Jammeh didn't want anybody to have a counter opinion or another voice from what he said and what they said. So that was the problem. I knew then there will have a problem because as journalists, of course, every day our job is to bring all sides of the opinion to the public domain. So I knew from then we were going to have problems with the junta.
So what I'm driving at is what kind of criticism you received from the members of the AFPRC following this incident. It was clear to you that they did not want to allow dissenting voices.
They started, of course, campaigning that, well, the Daily Observer destroyed Liberia, and they're going to continue to do the same thing in the Gambia. I mean, these sentiments were there, to be fair, even before the coup. I mean, there were people in the PPP regime who had these similar sentiments that, well, Mr. Best came from Liberia, and most of the things that happened there were caused by journalists like him, so probably he's going to bring the same thing here. I mean, there were sentiments like that during the PPP regime, but I think the PPP regime was more grounded in protecting democracy and freedom of expression. They didn't, the powers did not entertain that much. But then I started hearing the same things at the beginning of the AFPRC junta, so I knew that our paper was going to be targeted, and it happened that way.
Did anything happen to Mr. Bess as a result of these sentiments from the AFPRC?
Yes, he started having problems with them. They basically disagreed with virtually everything that's been written in the editorial columns. And matters came to a head in October '94 when he was first detained somewhere in Katong, the secret location, and then later he was deported to Liberia.
And this is from as early as October 1994.
That's why I said the honeymoon didn't even last long. From July to October, they had our boss deported.
Can you continue telling us about examples where the AFPRC did not agree with the Daily Observer?
Yes, in November, when they reported there was a coup attempt, then our editor was also the BBC correspondent. He filed a report and reported this in the Daily Observer. They didn't agree. They said Mr. Cisse, then his Raima Cisse, had said that all kind of weapons were used, artillery fire, whatever the descriptions were given. They didn't agree with that. They said that was a lie. So the journalists were lying, and he was working then for the Observer. So if they said he was lying on the BBC, then they meant he was lying on the Observer, in the Observer too. So that also contributed, to increase the animosity between us and them in the paper. And I don't mind telling you that after Mr. Best left, it was basically impossible for foreign workers in the paper to stay in there. They posted immigration officers, and whoever comes in will be screened whether you're from the Gambia or if you are from anywhere else, you will be torn away.
Just to be clear, they posted immigration officers at the Daily Observer.
Yes,
is that what you're saying?
At the gate, yes.
And what was the effect of that?
Well, they had this flimsy idea that most of the expertise that was produced in the paper, the expertise were coming from foreigners. They didn't realize that during the time, of course, the expertise had been transferred down to Gambians. So they thought when you stop foreigners from coming there, the paper wouldn't come out. They failed in that, but then they continued harassing the foreign staff, and eventually, after Mr. Best left, his nephew, Rodney D.C., who was my immediate boss, and he was BBC correspondent at the time, was also deported. So,
just to assist us with the record so that it's clear, you said Rodney Gissier.
Rodney D.C.
Can you spell the last name, please?
Sieh is S-I-E-H. Well, Rodney, of course, continues to be in trouble because even in Liberia, he became a big journalist there, and he ran the front page, Africa, I think now. He too was deported, forcibly taken to the plane and flown to London.
Do you recall when he was deported?
That must be November. That was in November. November '94.
So far we've had a few deportations.
Yeah.
October 1994, deportation of Mr. Best. Then Mr. Rodney Gissé.
Only this year, yeah.
Gissier in November 1994.
Yeah.
You also told us that immigration officers were posted at the Daily Observer.
Yeah.
Can
That
you tell? Yeah.
Continued for
Yes.
many, many years, yeah.
Do you recall for how long? How many years, roughly?
I think up till 1997, people have been deported. I remember one Nigerian journalist, Chikeluba Kenechukwu, another guy I can't remember, Mohammed Sol, and then even Ellicott Syed, who was also editor-in-chief at the time, and that was as late as 97, 96, 98, was also deported. And then several others left, some on their own accord because of the harassments. They included people like Justice Fofana, people like Aliu Badr Sharif, and so many others. They had to leave. Some were harassed so much that they couldn't stay anymore. They had to go because they knew they couldn't work under the climate.
I'm still focusing on the journalists at the Daily Observer. You mentioned harassment.
Yeah.
Can you give us a bit more explanation? What were some of the ways in which they would harass people, staff members, apart from deportations?
Well, for Gambians who remain there, frequent arrest and questioning was the order of the day. At the time, it wasn't that much serious. People would be picked for 2-3 days or for a few hours and be questioned and be brought back. But then I think as time went on, that became a little bit serious. Some will go for days. And then the Observer was always in the bad books of the government. Any moment they have time to criticize journalists, they will take the Observer as an example. That went up to 1999 and later beyond. But then up till 1999, the Observer came on the throne, so to speak, in the flesh of the regime.
So you mentioned a number of individuals being arrested and questioned, being detained sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Who was doing this arrest and questioning, as far as you know?
The junta, and through, of course, the NIA. I can't remember all names now, but I remember virtually half of all the Observer staff who were active with journalism must have been invited one way or the other to the NIA.
So you told us that this was pretty much the order of the day until 1999. What happened in 1999?
Well, in 1999, in May 1999, we got information through a letter that I read myself on the board at the newsroom that the paper has been sold to Amadou Samba and that he was the owner at the time from 1999, May 1999.
And did the fact that the paper was sold to Mr. Amadou Samba change anything in relation to how the Daily Observer worked?
That was a significant turning point because at the time, Mr. Samba was seen or perceived to be close to the regime. And many people believe that the paper may not be able to maintain its independence anymore because of the fact that the proprietor is perceived to be close to the APRC regime. And this definitely was the same feeling even within some editorial staff. I remember the editor-in-chief at the time, Babagale Jallo, resigned on principle that he didn't believe the paper could maintain its independence at the time. He resigned. But then, of course, at the time, I think a few months previously, he and his colleague had been working on the establishment of another paper. So when he left the Observer in 1999, it didn't take long for him and his colleague to start another paper. In July, I believe, 1999, and that was the Independent. I'm sure you will hear the story about Independent later. So we remain. And of course, the paper was trying very much to stay in the shape and form it used to be. at least the editorial staff will maintain the independence of the paper to some extent, created more columns, created more, introduced so many columns to make it even more interesting as before. But then, of course, the perception still remains in many people's mind that it will not be as it used to be. But then the editorial staff who did very well to ensure that that doesn't happen. They did not shy away from hard-hitting headlines that were in the news at the time, even though they were critical of the regime. But then, like I said, from 1999, many people thought that, the venom in the Daily Observer's tail, so to speak, probably had gone.
So what you're saying is that in spite of the paper being sold to Mr. Amadou Samba, who was perceived as being close to the then president at the time, the editorial staff was still able to publish hard-hitting stories?
To the best of their abilities, yes. They've maintained, they try to maintain the independence of the paper and not to avoid hard-hitting stories that wouldn't have been approved by the junta. But then, like I said, they did all the best what was possible under the circumstances. But then the perception that it probably had now lost its, was everywhere. But the editorial staff did very well to maintain that stand. And it went on like that until I think somewhere in the early 2000s when things became to be very bad.
So were there any attempts to directly interfere with the stories published by the Daily Observer?
Immediately after the sales, no, not something that was very visible. But then, of course, a little later, another event happened. Demba Ali Jao, who was news editor and was seen to be a very critical, a very critical columnist in the paper, was asked to go. He was asked to go. So this lent credence to the people who perceive that perhaps now the paper is no longer going to be independent. So if anything, Mr. Jao's sacking led to that, just to confirm that maybe things will not be as they used to be before.
So your point is that Mr. Demba Ali Jawo's, the fact that he was asked to resign is seen as an example of someone being very critical of the government being asked to let go.
Yes, he was a journalist who was very much principled in protecting his independence. And he's known to be one of the harshest critics of the regime at the time. He had a column which was very critical of the regime. And so when the paper was sold to Amadou, like I told you, even among the journalists who were there, some thought that perhaps things wouldn't be like the same. They resigned, like people like Baba Gale Jallow. A little later, Demba Ali Jawo didn't choose to resign immediately after, but then he said, well, perhaps if they had no interference with editorial matters, then he didn't feel the need to go at that time. But then a little later, he was asked to go.
Do you recall the date? Do you recall the date when he was asked to resign?
I can't remember, but it was later in the same year, 1999.
And do you recall who fired him or who asked him to go?
It will be the management, the new owners. It has to be. It has to be the new owners.
Are you speculating, or do you actually know who?
Oh yeah, of course, it was the new owners who asked him to go. The new management. And Sherian Cisse was brought in as managing director after the sale. Theophilus George was the one after Best left. So Theophilus was removed as manager when the paper was sold to Amadou Samba. And Sherian Cisse, who was then managing director of the, I think it was Custom Exercise, Custom. Then he was now GRA, was brought in as managing director. So it was under him that Jao was asked to go. That was new management by the new owners at the time.
So after the new management asked Mr. Demba Ali Jawo to leave, can you tell us about what happened next at the paper in terms of your ability to remain independent and?
Yes, like I told you, we did a lot under the circumstances to maintain the paper's independence. Like I told you, we make it even more interesting. We introduced columns, increased even size. I mean, to some extent, circulation, because a lot of other interesting columns were there. But then, of course, we had always lived under this climate that we are actually under a new management, and we know we will have troubles in the way we do things as opposed to the previous time when we were on the best.
What about direct interference? Was there any direct interference, for instance, from the State House?
That will come later, because I remember, like I told you, Syrian was himself removed in 2001 and replaced by Buba Balde. Buba Balde was a former minister in the PPP regime, but he was the only minister who actually embraced the AFPRC in the early days of their regime, and so he was accepted. He was basically a member of the AFPRC, and he came as manager. Well, that's definitely confirmed, even more vigorously, even more clear that the regime were ready now to take control of the paper. So when Buba Balde came, things got bad. I remember in June 2001, it went up to a point that there was a mass resignation of journalists in protest to what they perceived to be Buba's interference in 2001, June. So that shows you that there was direct interference then at the time coming from the powers that be.
Can you give us some examples of the direct interference that you're talking about?
Well, I'll tell you the argument about the journalist who resigned in 2001, led by the then editor-in-chief Pascal Eze. The argument was that Buba wouldn't be comfortable when stories of opposition, particularly the opposition propaganda, the propaganda secretary of the then opposition UDP, Lamin Juara, he claimed that Lamin Juara, stories about Lamin Juara shouldn't be published. And that didn't go down well. That was direct interference, because otherwise there's no point in saying those directives. So that and other things led to Pascal Eze instigating a resignation, mass resignation of journalists in June 2001.
So just to be clear, who said that stories of the opposition, such as Lamin Juara, should not be published?
Who was managing director at the time.
Please allow a few seconds in between our speeches so that we avoid overlap speech. And do you know where Buba Balde was getting his orders from?
Well, it could only be from the APRC, the big guns, the APRC. At the time, Baba Job had a lot of influence over the Observer. In fact, it was even said that he either owned it or was the one put in charge to run it. And there was Lang Conte, who was made board chairman of the paper. And both those people are through and through APRC bigwigs.
But your belief that the orders were coming from the AFPRC, is it speculation, or do you have any examples or information that would support that claim?
Yeah, through Buba's actions and directives. And Buba would always complain when he saw articles about opposition. I mean, after him, there would be no opposition stories in the paper. Now, we used to argue always time with him that, well, newspaper is different from any other commodity. It's different from any other commodity. This is a thing you must sell to the public. Now, if you shy away from carrying stories that is already in the public domain, the foreign and other competitors will pick it up. So there's no point if you shy away from taking it. They will be publishing anyway. So these are the kind of arguments we will counter whenever he raised opposition about us carrying opposition articles. We did that under the circumstances as much as possible to make sure that we don't shy away from stories. But we were definitely living under censorship, if you like, because he would always talk and complain when we carry stories that are critical of the regime. That was the state of affairs at the time.
So in essence, the interference, well, your inference is that he was receiving those orders from State House because of his behavior.
Well, at a time, maybe at least from the APRC bigwigs. And I told you the board member was Lang Conte, who was APRC, and Baba Job, who was even said to be owner at the time. There was even a word that he probably was the new owner. Those two people had influence as to what happened there, and even in the appointment of some staff who later came to join us.
And did you witness any instances where they exerted their influence?
Well, they wouldn't invite us to such meetings, but I know, of course, decisions such as those things are made by them when they go to maybe Baba Job or Lang Contest place, perhaps. Maybe that's where they make success. Or maybe it could be in Buba's office when they come there, but I wouldn't be privy to that. But I know for sure that they had influence in what was happening at the Observer.
Did the ownership of the paper change after Mr. Amadou Samba bought the paper?
Not officially. I think it had always remained Amadou Samba's paper, even though, like I told you, there were very strong rumors that it was Baba Job's paper, but I didn't have any evidence of that. I knew he was very influential in Observer matters between 2001 downwards until his own arrest and incarceration in 2003. But I had no evidence, but definitely there was a strong rumor that he probably is a new owner or had some shares.
So earlier you mentioned the fact that the president at the time, Yahya Jammeh, had certain views about the media, and you gave us an example where he called journalists the illegitimate sons of Africa. You said that was at a Bakau rally.
Yeah.
Do you have other examples of the way in which the former president viewed journalists?
Well, for example, when he came first, he had one press conference that was open to all the media, including independent media, but he stopped that. And he only would call journalists, foreign journalists who, probably have come for PR job or something, who would come, and he would organize press conferences for them in his press team, and the independent journalists of the Gambia exempted from his press conferences. That is one example of his nature towards Gambian journalists. Every opportunity he had, he will lambast journalists. He would say some of them are not educated. They are all opposition-based. They are against progress. They are unpatriotic. Those were common pronouncements he would always make. He made no secret of his hatred for journalists. That's public knowledge.
And this hatred, as you called it, did you feel any similar sentiments from other members of the government or any agents of the state?
Well, of course, I think Jammeh was law unto himself, so whatever he said is implemented. I definitely saw people who were very hostile to journalists, who are not necessarily Jammeh himself, but civil servants, for example. They won't talk. They won't talk to you. They perceive you to be, people who are just, how would you call it? People who are just nuisances, who just want to make trouble. And that's the picture he painted of journalists. And of course, he was law unto himself, so everybody followed suit. They had a hostile relationship with journalists. It was impossible to get information from public officials. It was impossible.
And what about the security agents? How would you describe their behavior towards journalists during that time?
Well, most of the people who got into trouble actually got into trouble through security agents. They were the ones who picked us up, who roughened up, at meetings, who prevented us from going there. So there were elements in the security, yes, who are answerable to Jammeh, and they would do anything to stop journalism and journalists from doing their work. That was clear.
So putting aside what happened to you, which we will get to very shortly, can you tell us a bit about some of the ways in which the security agents either harassed or dealt with journalists? Any examples that you know of?
Well, there were many incidents. The earliest incident I remember was our reporter Abdullah Savage, who went to the Bakau barracks in the aftermath of the attempted coup of November 1994. He was beaten up, battered, and was almost killed. That was one incident.
Before you proceed, who was he beaten up by?
Abdullah Savage, by the soldiers, of course, the Fajara barracks. He went there to find out, what happened, and he was beaten up there. And so many others were beaten up by security. I remember a Sierra Leonean journalist who was supposed to have written a report about how Sierra Leoneans, or a Sierra Leonean was maltreated, and the police invaded him and he was beaten. There were many incidents where our reporters' recorders were taken from them and never returned. And so many other incidents I can remember. I'm sure you have a detail of that later when other testimonies come, individually, who would have accurate catalog of those harassments. But it was rampant. It was just rampant. It was the order of the day. Every little reporter has his own story to tell at the hands of the security.
You told us earlier that there was a deliberate and very clear assault on journalists.
Yeah.
You also mentioned other ways in which journalists were treated, the hostility, the brutality. Can you just generally sum up for us what the climate was as a journalist at that time and what effect that had?
It was a very hostile climate during Jammeh's time. In fact, most of Jammeh's time, almost all the time. Because if you look at his regime right from the beginning up to the end, even when he was leaving, private radio stations were been locked up during the impasse. So there was never a dull moment in the relationship between the junta and the media. It was always hostile. Jammeh didn't believe journalists had any role to play in the government, because as far as he's concerned, his opinion is that the views of the opposition or views that are contrary to his beliefs and views comes through journalists as communication agents. So if journalism is stifled, the journalists are prevented from doing their work, then he will get his way. And that is, the voice of the voiceless will be silenced and dissenting views will die down. That was his principle, and he did everything to ensure that that existed when he was here. And that he carried out in all shape and form. At some extent, even killing. Journalists actually are the most, I can say journalism was the most oppressed professional body. Journalists are the most professional body on the Jammeh. But of course, it must be acknowledged that we were the body that continuously resisted his oppression. Even though we saw our men fell, our colleagues fell to the bullets in some cases, disappearances, horrendous torture, but journalism stayed.
So from what you've said, your view is that journalists were the most targeted?
We are the most targeted professional body in this country on the Jammeh. Okay, of course, politicians can argue in a different angle, but I believe everybody agreed that journalists suffered the most.
And from what you've said, your belief is that the motivation was to stifle dissenting opinions and different views that the regime did not want to hear.
Entrenched tyranny, because freedom of expression would stop tyranny from happening, and Jammeh's aim was to cut that down and let nobody has any voice other than his voice. And because journalists are communication agents, he would start with them. If they are imprisoned, killed, or made to run away, then of course there will be nobody to tell the story of these people who are not in agreement with him. That was his style. So we suffered the most because we refused to go his way and keep him quiet and leave our people to rot and their voices to be stifled. That's why it's fair to say that journalism suffered the most at the hands of Jammeh than any other professional body. I stand to be corrected, but I think it's clear.
So, Mr. Cham, did you become a victim of the regime?
Yes, I had my own experience. Well, of course, before my experience, of course, I have just been cataloging a lot of troubles we had. And then, of course, in December 2004, we had, at the time, the most serious case, the killing of Deda Haidara. That definitely was a very, very landmark turning point, because we began to take seriously that, look, this matter is now becoming very serious. Whereas we were thinking that it was going to be a matter of torture, detentions, arrest, and exile, now the regime is prepared to even take lives, our own lives. So the killing of Deda Haidara actually changed the whole ball of game, and everybody began to sit properly and know that, well, we are in serious trouble.